Before my mum married my dad, she actually dated a guy called Craig. At first, he was actually a really sweet guy, but he slowly became abusive. My mum tried to leave multiple times, but Craig always threatened her. After one violent argument, my mum waited and fled in the middle of the night. Years passed and she got married and had me. My dad's work included a lot of travelling, so it was mostly my mum and I alone in our big acreage home. My mum was in the kitchen making lasagna while I was sitting on my high chair one day. It was an extremely hot day too, so she opened the kitchen door to let in some air. But it wasn't too long after this that she heard heavy footsteps enter in the kitchen behind her. My excited mum assumed that it was my dad, and she turned around with a "Hello, my love." Her excitement immediately turned to horror, because there was Craig standing in the middle of our kitchen with a gun visibly tucked into his pants. Craig smiled at her and asked what she was making. My mum mustered enough courage and said lasagna. She was physically shaking as Craig sat himself down beside me. He sort of playfully pinched my cheek and I laughed at him. My mum was holding back tears as she finally asked what he was doing in the house. Craig said that he just wanted to visit my mum and he would leave when he was done eating. And when the lasagna was ready, she served it to him. My mum took me and sat across from Craig so she could keep an eye on him. Craig said that he still had her things at his house and she was welcome to get them. My mum said that she didn't need any of it and that he could throw it out. Craig started to get agitated at this and said that she threw him away like garbage too. Craig said that she was acting tough, but he knew deep down inside that she was still the stupid girl that he had dated. Craig claimed that my mum needed him in her life and that she couldn't function if he wasn't there to help her. He said that he needed to be there to raise me because my dad was, well, some nasty words, who would never be able to protect my mum and I. Craig said that if he was crazy, that he could have easily kidnapped us or done things to my mum because my dad was weak and he wouldn't be able to protect what was his. At this, my mum started to cry and told Craig to leave the house. Craig said that it wasn't her house and that he had the right to be there. My mum said that if he didn't leave, that she would call the police, which really made him angry. Craig threatened then that if the cops got involved, that he would hire men to cut her up into pieces and film it. My mum started to cry even louder, and an agitated Craig threw his plate and yelled at her to stop crying and that he loved her. I got scared and started to cry too, which caused Craig to stand up and approach my mum. She jumped out of a chair with me cradled in her arms. She begged for Craig to spare my life. Craig tried to reach over to touch my mum, but she got so scared that she fell to the floor sobbing. The phone began to ring and Craig became so overwhelmed that apparently he just ran out of the house. The cops and his family found him about to shoot himself in his head, and his adult son had to convince him not to do it. My mum was so traumatized that she didn't want to deal with any of it, so she got a restraining order against him, and eventually her and my dad moved across the country. I was curious though, and I searched this guy up and was shocked to see that he was dating a college-age girl who looked just like the woman he couldn't have. Three years ago, October in Minnesota, I just started dating my now wife. I was really obsessed with working out and asked her if she would like to use one of my guest passes at the YMCA. She begrudgingly agreed, and we started heading to the closest YMCA near her house. We were about a couple of miles away from the gym with my wife driving south on a busy street when I noticed on the other side of the road heading north, a woman was walking on the sidewalk while holding something. Next to her too, driving slowly on the shoulder of the road, was an F-350. And I don't know why, but the hairs on my neck stood up and I shuddered after seeing them. My whole body had goosebumps. I told my wife that she needed to do a U-turn so we could see what was going on. We did the U-turn and got behind the F-350. I noticed immediately too that the woman was barefoot and holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. I got out of the car at this and I told my wife to stay in the car and to call the police if anything happened. When I started walking towards the woman, The first thing that I noticed was that she was barefoot. With it being October in Minnesota too, the temperature was around 50 degrees, so no one should be walking around without shoes and socks on. When I got closer to her, I saw that the baby was only wearing a diaper wrapped in a thin blanket. As I got closer, I hear the guy in the truck yelling at the woman to please get in the truck now. I finally reached the woman and asked if she was okay and if she needed help. She said yes, and that the guy wouldn't leave her alone. Right then, a different woman started jogging past. I forgot my phone in the car, so I asked the woman jogging if she had a cell phone, and if she could call the police, which she did immediately. I turned around to face the truck, and I see the man getting out. As he's walking towards us, he's now pleading with this woman to get in his truck with him. I positioned myself between him and this woman, and he stopped when he was about 3 feet away from me. I told him that he wasn't going to come any closer and that the police were on their way. Now, while the guy did stop walking towards us, he completely ignored me though and didn't acknowledge what I just said. And this is where the story gets a little weird. You see, the two of them started having a conversation that just made zero sense, with me standing in between them. He said, "Honey, just get in the truck and come home." She said, "You kicked me out and told me to leave." He said, "No, I didn't. I came upstairs and you and the baby were gone." She said, "You never let me leave," which was the opposite of what she just said, and never let me do anything and never let me spend any of our money. He said, "We don't have any money. Our credit cards are maxed out. You don't have shoes on and our baby is cold. Please, let's just go home." She then yelled, "I am never coming home with you. You don't let us do anything ever." At this point, 2 police cars showed up with 4 cops. 1 cop spoke with the man and 1 with the woman, and the other 2 cops took statements from both me and the jogger. To this day, I'm still not sure what took place that day with the couple and the baby. I had stepped in because I guess I had automatically assumed that some sort of abuse was taking place where the woman was trying to escape in. Maybe that was happening, or maybe the woman was having some sort of a mental breakdown. I don't know what happened there, but something really strange was going on, and the fact that that lady was out there walking barefoot and barely anything, and also the baby was wrapped like it was a pretty risky situation for sure, particularly for the child, but I don't know. Maybe they're okay, maybe they're not. All I can say is that it was a really weird and sort of creepy situation, which I'm grateful that the police handled in the end. So this happened in Brazil when I was about 10 or 11, around 2004. I remember it was exactly 9 p.m. and I was playing The Sims on the family computer with my cousin. I got to the cabinet, got a glass cup, and went to the water filter. The filter was right next to the big window with undulating glass panels. Common in Brazil, something for privacy, I think. The undulated glass made everything that was far look fractured, and the closer an object was, the less distorted it got. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings, but I was always a little scared of going into the kitchen at night because every time I turned the lights on, pigeons that were just chilling outside, there was a narrow corridor to the backyard outside the kitchen window with a high wall separating the houses. They started flapping their wings frantically, making a lot of noise and honestly scaring me half to death. Anyway, this time I didn't really check if there were pigeons because I didn't hear any noise. The windows were closed and there was only one light source lighting the outside. I finally fill my cup and I start drinking, and as soon as I'm finished and start putting the glass down, I look up and there's a dark shape outside. And because I was holding a glass cup, I was carefully putting it down before considering running away, but I took that time to take a very good look at it. It was so close to the window that there wasn't much distortion at all. The shape of a dark brown, but not brown like human skin, head, and a neck with huge pitch black, almost perfect circles as eyes. There was no indication of a nose or ears, but there was a small shadow where the mouth should be. as if it was a very small mouth with no lips. But the strange thing is that I didn't move the slightest the whole time that it was there. The black eyes felt like they were staring right at me. I was petrified. Afterwards, I absolutely bolted out of the kitchen, screaming and telling my cousin to go check on that window. She obviously didn't want to, so I myself, after about 2 minutes, went back to check, and there was nothing there. There was no sound, there was no creature or thing, whatever it was. Me and my granddad went to check the backyard the next day, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. I was never a kid that really believed in anything paranormal, but it was so strange that I still don't really know what to make of it.
Throughout their rich and storied history, the United States' Federal Bureau of Investigation has examined a multitude of frightening and unsettling crimes. But in the mid-1970s, the FBI was tasked with investigating a series of violent incidents that had captured the attention of the American public. It was a story of alleged brainwashing, militant politics, and innocence lost. It raised questions that have remained unanswered even all these years later. This is the story of Patty Hearst. Patricia Campbell Hearst was born in San Francisco on February 20th of 1954 and was a granddaughter of billionaire media mogul William Randolph Hearst. At the time of his passing in 1951, William Hearst's assets were valued at the modern equivalent of $330 billion. William's vast wealth made his family one of the richest in the world, and with money came fame. By the mid-70s, the Hearsts were a household name throughout the state of California, synonymous with old money, excess, and the trappings of capitalism. Some found their story to be inspirational, regarding Hearst as the personification of the American dream, but their billions also made them a target for those with sinister intentions. On February 4th of 1974, Patty was a 19-year-old college sophomore living with her fiancé in an apartment on Berkeley's Bienvenue Street. She tended not to flaunt her family's name or status among her social circle, but regardless, once one or two of her neighbors figured out exactly who she was, people began to talk. It was hot gossip that a member of the esteemed Hearst family was living in a hippie hole like Berkeley, but for the most part, the neighborhood greeted the news with either curiosity or indifference. There was no perceived threat to Patty's safety, and unlike some other members of the family, Patty did not have a bodyguard or any other kind of personal security. When this came to the attention of certain malevolent and delusional individuals, a plan was hatched, one which led to a group of armed thugs invading Patty's apartment at around 9 p.m. on the evening of February 4th. They began viciously assaulting Patty's fiancé, with one of their number choking her unconscious before she was thrown in the trunk of her kidnapper's car. Then, once their target was secure, the kidnappers simply took off in their vehicles, with Patty as their prisoner. The next time the trunk was opened, Patty had regained consciousness, and she was told that she'd be shot dead if she screamed or attempted to escape. Her captors then gagged her, blindfolded her, and carried her from the trunk into a makeshift cell somewhere far from prying eyes. After a brief period of captivity, Patty's kidnappers explained that she was now a hostage and that their ransom demands would be announced shortly. But unlike any other criminal organization whose members would rather mask their identities, Patty's kidnappers were only too happy to explain that she had been taken prisoner by the Symbionese Liberation Army. There's a good chance that Patty had already heard of the so-called United Federated Forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army, and at the very least, she will have been familiar with the cold-blooded murder they meted out. Just a few months before her kidnapping, Patty might have heard the news that Oakland's superintendent of public schools had been gunned down in public, with the assassin using cyanide-tipped bullets to guarantee the death of their target. This had been the work of the SLA, who explained to Patty that the Marcus Foster's murder had been part of a wider campaign to promote feminist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist ideals. What's more, Patty's kidnap was intended to leverage her family's political influence in order to free the SLA members who had been arrested for Foster's murder. Shortly after the SLA announced their list of demands, the state of California let it be known that under no circumstances would either of the SLA murder suspects be released. When the state made it clear that they wouldn't budge on the matter, the SLA released a new list of demands, swapping out the prisoner exchange for a call for the Hearst family to use $400 million of their fortune to end food poverty in California. In response, the Hearst family announced the creation of the $2 million relief fund called People in Need. The organization would set about feeding needy families in the Bay Area for a year, but once it was set up, Patty's kidnappers refused to release her, arguing that a paltry $2 million was just a fraction of their original demand. Yet as the Hearst family continued to negotiate for Patty's release, the Symbionese Liberation Army began a new phase of Patty's detainment: systematic brainwashing. Patty later said that for the first week of her capture, she was kept bound and blindfolded in a small, dark closet. She claims she was assaulted, tortured, and berated almost non-stop, and that at one point, her captors subjected her to a mock execution. Once her spirit was sufficiently broken, the SLA began to let Patty out of her makeshift prison cell in order to join their political discussions. If she showed an interest in their meetings and participated in discussions, she was given more food than her usual allowance, incentivizing her to educate herself on the subjects of their conversations. Around the same time, she was given several pieces of literature, including the SLA's manifesto and a small reading light, so she could continue her so-called political awakening from the confines of her cell. After months of routine brainwashing techniques, Patty claimed that the SLA leadership presented her with an ultimatum. She was told that negotiations for her release had completely failed and that she had outlived her use to the organization. According to the SLA founder, Donald DeFries, this left the group with no choice but to execute her. However, there was one thing Patty could do to save her own life, and that was to enlist in the ranks of the SLA and pledge her undying loyalty to them. DeFries told me that the War Council was thinking about killing me unless I was with them, and that I better start thinking about that as a possibility, Patty later said. After that, I simply accommodated my thoughts to coincide with theirs. After Patty swore an oath to fight and die with her new comrades, her blindfold was finally taken off, and she greeted her former jailers for the first time. The mood was decidedly different, to say the least, and as those that had once tortured her now embraced her as family, Patty Hearst's brainwashing was complete. From then on, she was treated just like any other member of the group, and although she later claimed to have been acting out of a will to survive, Patty certainly played the part of the enthusiastic young revolutionary. She attended political education sessions, mastered a number of different firearms, and according to some ex-SLA members, partook in a number of the group's free love events. She also consented to record a piece of audio that the SLA planned on releasing to the public, and in it, Patty announced that she had changed her name to Tanya and that she was now a full-time urban guerrilla. When the tape was released, it caused a wave of intense interest from local and national media, and it wasn't long before the FBI was called in to investigate. Then, on April 15th of 1974, just over 2 months after she first disappeared, a San Francisco branch of the Hibernia Bank became the target of an SLA robbery. The nation was stunned when a pale and gaunt Patty Hearst was recorded on the bank's surveillance cameras. According to one witness, she was wielding an assault rifle, and upon entering the bank she shouted, "I'm Tanya, up against the wall, now." The robbery ended up going horribly wrong when 2 bank customers, ignorant of the situation inside, walked into the bank to be greeted by a hail of bullets. The bloodshed prompted a premature end to the robbery as the SLA members rushed to a nearby getaway car, And that's when something curious happened. According to the bank's surveillance camera footage, Patty Hearst was the last member of the stick-up crew to reach the getaway car and seems to hesitate in a few frames of the recording. It then becomes apparent that one or two SLA members are pointing their weapons at her as if threatening to shoot her unless she gets into the van. Some have argued that Patty may have been using this moment to consider an escape, while others state that the guns weren't aimed at her, but rather at the bank's doors should they be required to cover their retreat. Either way, the incident transformed Patty's public image from a former kidnap victim into a wanted criminal, and a judge approved a warrant for her arrest. Just over a month later, the manager of Amel's Sporting Goods in Inglewood observed a minor theft occurring in one of his stores. When the manager attempted to apprehend the suspected thief as he walked towards his van, a heavily armed Patty Hearst leapt from the vehicle and began firing a high-caliber rifle right into the air. This caused the manager to run for cover as the shoplifter hurled himself into the van's side door. Knowing that the police would be actively searching for them, Patty Hearst and her shoplifter comrade hijacked two different cars while holding each of the former drivers as hostages. They hoped to once again use the hostages as leverage for their own release, but it was too late, as just hours later, the LAPD had surrounded the SLA's Los Angeles headquarters with the intention of bringing the group down once and for all. During the ensuing firefight, 6 SLA members were shot and killed by police officers, while the group's leader took their own life in preference to being taken alive. The murder of her comrades seemed to radicalize Patty even further, and in the aftermath of their funerals, she poured herself into the construction of improvised bombs, 2 of which were used in failed attempts to kill police officers in August of 1975. Yet Patty's foray into bomb making would be her undoing, and evidence recovered from the 2 explosive devices led to her arrest in a San Francisco apartment on September 18th of 1975. As she was booked into jail, Patty supposedly listed her occupation as urban guerrilla and asked her attorney to relay the following message to the general public. "Tell everybody that I'm smiling," she said, "that I feel free and strong, and I send my greetings and love to all the sisters and brothers out there." When Patty was arrested, she was barely recognizable to the sweet young lady who had been kidnapped a year and a half earlier. She weighed a stick-thin 87 pounds, and a psychologist noticed signs of severe mental impairment, later describing her as a low IQ zombie. Patty couldn't seem to remember large tracts of her life before joining the SLA, and confessed to being plagued by horrifying nightmares which reflected her time in captivity. At her trial for the Hibernia bank robbery, an unsympathetic judge dismissed any claim of brainwashing and ruled that Patty's taped and written statements were made on a completely voluntary basis. According to him, since she wasn't deemed to be suffering from any kind of recognizable mental illness, she was fit to stand trial. The judge also paid particular attention to a jailhouse recording of a visiting day conversation between Patty and a friend of hers, in which she used to speak of how her radical beliefs remained steadfast in the face of a lengthy prison sentence. Dr. Harry Kozel described Hearst as a rebel in search of a cause, and her participation in the Hibernia robbery had been an act of free will. Another psychologist was asked if Patty was in fear of death or great bodily injury during the robbery, to which she gave the resounding answer of no. Patty's own defense hinged on her claim that she had been suffering from the now famous Stockholm Syndrome. Her attorneys argued that her SLA captors had demanded she appear enthusiastic during the robbery and warned she would pay with her life for any mistake, while in reference to the sporting goods robbery, Patty claimed that when it happened, "I didn't even think. I just did it. And if I had not done it, and if they had been able to get away, they would have killed me." With regards to the public statements she made, Patty claimed that she had been writing the SLA version of events and had been punched in the face by one of her captors when she refused to be more militant in her words and actions. She also claimed to have been repeatedly violated by her captors for even the smallest of infractions. When news of these allegations reached the surviving SLA members, they were outraged and claimed that Patty had been in a romantic relationship with one of the men she'd accused. It was even alleged that Patty had been given a stone trinket by the man and had been so close to him that she kept the carving with her in her jail cell. This trinket was later paraded before the jury, who saw it as powerful evidence of Patty's deception, despite claims she believed it was a pre-Columbian artifact of archaeological significance. Despite appeals for mercy, Patty was convicted of the bank robbery on March 20th of 1976 and was handed the maximum sentence of 35 years imprisonment. However, this was later reduced to 7 years after another judge declared the original sentence to be overly harsh. Almost immediately after her arrival in prison, Patty had to undergo emergency surgery after suffering a collapsed lung. But curiously, the same condition prevented her from appearing at the trials of 2 of her former SLA comrades. Then, after she finally agreed to testify, the prison took no special security measures for her safety until she found a dead rat on her bunk on the day of an SLA member's hearing. Patty's brainwashing defense was revisited years later, after Representative Leo Ryan was murdered while visiting the Jonestown settlement in Guyana. By happenstance, he had been collecting signatures on a petition for Patty's release in the weeks before his murder, and the incident garnered the attention of none other than legendary actor John Wayne. Wayne pointed out the contradiction in the public accepting that Jim Jones had brainwashed 900 individuals into taking their own life en masse, but refusing to believe that the SLA could have brainwashed a young and impressionable teenager. The actor's plea touched the hearts of many who were skeptical of Patty's brainwashing claims, and it prompted President Jimmy Carter to secure her release from prison 8 months before she was eligible for her first parole hearing. Patty later recovered full civil rights when President Bill Clinton granted her a pardon on his last day in office. It's almost impossible to determine the exact truth of Patty Hearst's kidnapping, and if she really believed in the Symbionese Liberation Army's core ethics. But if it's true, if she really was brainwashed by her captives, the implications are terrifying. There's no doubt that Patty came from an especially privileged background, but by all accounts, she was still just a regular teenage girl. But once she was a prisoner of a group of deranged radicals, all it took was a few days of starvation and torture, and that regular teenage girl was gone. On November 1st of 1955, United Airlines Flight 629 took off from Stapleton Airport in Denver, Colorado at 6:52 p.m. It had been bound for Portland, Oregon, but the doomed flight would never arrive as just 11 minutes after takeoff, all 39 passengers and 5 crew members were instantly killed when their plane crashed on a sugar beet farm near Longmont, Colorado. As news of the tragedy spread like wildfire across the nation, the FBI volunteered itself to undertake any upcoming investigation into the crash. The following day, while the victims' bodies were still being identified, an FBI scientist was sent to the scene to conduct an examination of the wreckage. He discovered that the tail section of the plane had been cleanly severed from the rest of it, so cleanly it was as if it had been cut with a knife, and that it had fallen with only minor damage approximately 1.5 miles from the main crash site. The scientists also ruled out the possibility of an explosion due to malfunction, and noted that the plane seemed to have been in perfect working condition when it took off on its final flight. Less than a week later, the Civil Aeronautics Board Chief of Investigations officially stated that there were indications of sabotage and invited the FBI to open up a criminal investigation into the 44 murders which took place that day. The very next day, the FBI ordered at least a dozen of its agents to work on the case full-time, and over the weeks that followed, 4 teams of interviewers questioned almost 24 different people in order to gather witness testimonies. Witnesses claimed that the initial explosion had occurred while the plane was operating in a routine manner, and that it appeared to have been of tremendous force, causing fiery streamers to fall from the plane. A second explosion, probable of 1 or more fuel tanks, had occurred when the engines and forward compartment of the plane struck the ground. The scientists ordered that the investigative team recover as many pieces of the wreckage as they could, and bit by bit, the plane was then reassembled in a kind of giant jigsaw puzzle at a nearby warehouse, and this served two purposes. Firstly, reassembling the wreckage would allow investigators to identify the exact location of the explosion that caused the crash, but the process would also allow investigators to identify and isolate any foreign materials that may have constituted an explosive device. Before the wreckage was even fully assembled, investigators were able to determine that the explosion had occurred in the plane's fourth cargo pit, meaning that the detonation had originated in a piece of luggage loaded onto the plane at Denver Airport. As the analysis of the plane's wreckage continued, investigators discovered 5 small fragments of sheet metal were found which could not in any way be identified with parts of the plane or known contents of the cargo. These fragments were coated with a kind of gray soot associated with an explosion, and one of them was determined to have come from a type of 6-volt battery, the kind one might use to power a remote detonator. It became evident that the downing of Flight 629 was no tragic accident. It was a devastating, deliberate act of murder involving the smuggling of a bomb onto the plane. As the investigation progressed, FBI agents began to profile the lives of each innocent victim. They interviewed hundreds of their family members, friends, and employers, hoping to identify any potential motive for homicide. Agents also set about poring over the remains of the victims' luggage and personal effects, and it was during this process that something intriguing came to light. On board the doomed aircraft that day was a woman by the name of Daisy E. King, and after recovering and collating a series of personal letters, newspaper clippings, an address list, and 2 keys for safety deposit boxes, investigators were able to put together a detailed picture of her life and family. One of the newspaper clippings revealed that her son, Jack Gilbert Graham, was wanted on charges of forgery dating back to 1951. This might not have been all that alarming on its own, but the petty financial crime became all the more interesting once agents conducted another piece of analysis. A large effort was made to identify victims who'd had large travel life insurance policies taken out in their name prior to the fatal flight. This is how agents discovered that Daisy E. King had no less than 3 large policies in her name, something they found highly suspicious considering most other passengers had no more than 2. When such compelling evidence was presented to a federal judge, a search warrant was quickly drawn up to authorize the search of Jack Gilbert Graham's home. During the search, police officers recovered the paperwork for a $40,000 travel insurance policy that Jack had taken out on his mother in the months before she died. It was also discovered that Jack had recently hired an attorney to rewrite his mother's life insurance policy, naming himself the recipient of the vast majority of his mother's estate. After interviewing friends and family members, FBI agents learned that Jack and his mother had an extremely fraught relationship, and during his teenage years, Jack often found himself homeless after a particularly violent argument occurred. Agents also learned that Jack and his mother had reunited later in life to operate their own drive-in restaurant, but that the venture had almost failed on account of their volatile relationship. One former friend of Daisy's mentioned that Jack had apparently caused a small explosion at the restaurant after one altercation, and that he had repeatedly been caught pilfering money from the registers. After the FBI began delving into Jack Gilbert Graham's history, agents discovered a number of pertinent and disturbing details. An associate of Graham's mentioned how he'd once performed demolition work in the U.S. Navy and that Graham had once purchased a brand new truck, took out an insurance policy on it, then wrecked it under suspicious circumstances almost immediately afterward. FBI agents also discovered the details of Graham's forgeries, learning he'd committed the crimes while employed as a payroll clerk for a factory in Denver. Graham had stolen a number of blank checks, forged the name of the company owner, then cashed the checks for approximately $4,200 in cash. Graham was convicted of the forgeries on November 3rd of 1951, but the sentence was suspended, and he had been placed on probation for a period of 5 years. Graham might have dodged a spell in prison, but the financial restitution broke his proverbial bank, and there's no doubt that this left him a very desperate man. FBI agents first interviewed Graham just over a week after the bombing, with a particular interest paid to the small explosion that had occurred at his mother's restaurant. Graham stated that the explosion was caused by someone disconnecting a gas line and describing how the gas had filled the room until it reached a pilot light on a water heater, igniting the gas and causing the explosion. He had vehemently denied that he might have been involved in the explosion, and due to the interview taking place on a purely voluntary basis, investigators were forced to pursue a different line of questioning so not to rile Graham up too much. Questions then turned to the contents of his mother's luggage, and although Graham denied knowing what she'd packed, he seemed to suggest that she may have been in possession of a large amount of shotgun shells and rifle ammunition, and that she intended to use them to hunt caribou in Alaska. The fact that Graham seemed to know that an explosion had occurred, and that he also seemed to know how it occurred, was something investigators found deeply suspicious, and after Graham's wife was questioned, the evidence against him became considerably more damning. Gloria Graham shared 2 children with Jack and confirmed that his mother had been living with them in the time before her death. She also mentioned that on the day she died, Jack had given his mother a present, a box believed to contain a small set of tools for forming seashells into art objects. Gloria recalled that this package was the size of a large shoebox and wrapped up in decorative paper, and that Jack insisted on packing the gift into her suitcase as a surprise. Gloria also mentioned that after dropping his mother off at the airport, Jack had been pale and nauseous. She asked him if everything was okay, but her husband brushed her concerns off by telling her that he'd eaten some bad food. Then, after receiving news of his mother's death, Jack didn't seem like he was grieving properly. In fact, he seemed vexed by something. He was barely eating or sleeping, and he spent most of his time walking up and down both inside and outside their home. Jack Graham's half-sister also had a lot to say about him, telling FBI agents that he had a warped, morbid sense of humor, and had actually witnessed Jack assaulting his wife. She also confirmed that, although she'd never seen any evidence of it, her half-brother had boasted of his experience in manufacturing explosives. On November 12th of 1955, the FBI invited Jack and Gloria down to their offices under the pretense of their assistance being required. The next day, they voluntarily appeared at the Denver FBI office, where they were shown fragments of Daisy's luggage. The couple were as helpful as can be, and were treated as nicely as possible by the attending agents, but at the conclusion of the appointment, the agents told Jack that they wished to interview him further concerning several aspects of the case. A particular interest to the agents was Jack's suggestion that a box of ammunition might be to blame for the explosion, and their follow-up questions concerned the gift Jack had given his mother on the day of the plane crash. Jack then contradicted his wife's previous statement and told the FBI that he had not given her a set of crafting tools on the day of her departure. At first, Jack was indignant in the face of the FBI's insinuations, but once again grew pale when the agents asked him what he had done with his mother upon driving her to the airport. When the agents produced a copy of a travel insurance policy that Jack's mother had bought prior to her flight, he had no choice but to admit that he'd made himself the sole beneficiary. Shortly after the interview, Graham was informed that he was a suspect in the case. He refused to submit to a polygraph test, but gave the FBI his consent to search his home, automobiles, and property. During the search of Graham's home, a small roll of copper wire with yellow insulation was located in a shirt pocket of some work clothes. Experts agreed that the wire appeared to be the type used in detonating primer caps. When confronted with the evidence of his bomb making, Jack broke under the pressure and admitted planning the explosive device, killing 43 people in order to ensure his mother's death. He went on to describe how he'd used a time bomb composed of 25 sticks of dynamite, 2 electric primer caps, a timer, and a 6-volt battery. Jack Graham had already admitted his guilt, but at his first court hearing on December 9th of 1955, he claimed he was innocent by reason of insanity before, during, and after the alleged commission of the crime. Graham was then examined by doctors at the Colorado Psychopathic Hospital, and during an interview with one of the doctors, he claimed that he'd concocted his entire confession. He claimed that he'd gotten the idea from a photograph he'd seen in an FBI agent's office, one which depicted the apprehension of the Nazi saboteurs who had landed on the Florida coast during World War II. In the background of the picture, a trio of FBI agents are digging up a cache of dynamite that had been buried on a beach, and Jack claimed that his fractured mind had latched onto the idea of explosives. Despite his assertions of being mentally unwell, Graham was found legally sane by all 4 psychiatrists, and he was taken back to the Denver County Jail. For almost 2 months, Graham was a model prisoner, and his jail time was mostly spent quietly reading or chatting with the guards. But just after 5:30 p.m. on February 10th of 1956, the sheriff's deputy tasked with keeping an eye on Graham's cell block heard an unusual sound coming from one of the cells. After further examination, the deputy determined the sound was coming from Jack Graham's cell, and when he opened the door, he found that Graham had tried to strangle himself with a pair of socks. The deputy quickly untied the makeshift garrote, saving Graham's life before he was transported to the prison's hospital. Once Graham regained consciousness, he was placed in a straitjacket, then taken to the psychiatric ward of Colorado General Hospital, where he was strapped to a bed with 4 guards posted nearby. Then, as the days went by, Graham stunned psychiatrists by talking freely and honestly about his involvement in the bombing. He admitted that the whole scheme had been a plot to kill his mother, and that he didn't feel an ounce of remorse for taking almost 50 other people with her. I realized that there were about 50 or 60 people carried on that kind of plane, but the number of people to be killed made no difference to me. It could have been 1,000, he said. When their time comes, there's nothing they can do about it. On February 24th of 1956, Graham finally dropped the insanity plea and was returned again to Denver County Jail. His April 16th trial set an all-time record for the state of Colorado in the number of jurors examined. In all, 231 were called, and the final jury represented a cross-section of American life. It included 2 housewives, 1 a former beauty queen, 2 typists, a movie executive, an engineer, a truck driver, a sales lady, a telephone man, a lithographer, a bookkeeper, and a salesman. On the first day and almost throughout the trial, hundreds of people waited for hours in the halls outside the courtroom, hoping for a chance to get seats. They brought their lunches, afraid to leave the room for fear of losing their places. The guard at the door, however, saved a seat for one woman who arrived promptly at 9 a.m. each morning. She was an attractive, young-looking woman who just so happened to be the wife of the United Airlines pilot of the ill-fated flight, who sat only a few feet from Graham throughout the trial. The accused remained calm as the trial progressed, and although Graham had lost weight since his arrest, he still looked relatively healthy. He slouched in his chair, chewed gum, and even joked with his legal team, all while a district attorney described him as a straight-up monster, someone who had taken the lives of almost 50 people, including his own mother, coldly, carefully, and deliberately. Finally, on May 5th of 1956, the jury took just an hour to find Jack Gilbert Graham guilty of murder in the first degree, with a recommendation that he receive the penalty of death. The judge then sentenced him to be put to death in late August of 1956, and after a brief stay at the Colorado State Penitentiary, Graham was executed in the gas chamber at 8 p.m. on Friday, January 11th of 1957. The bombing of Flight 629 is arguably one of the worst single acts of mass murder in American history, but it isn't the death toll that makes it one of the most infamous. It's that a man wanted to get away with the murder of his own mother, so much that he thought nothing of killing 43 other people in the process. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Just before 11 a.m. in Kansas City on September 28th of 1953, a nun working at a school for small children was confronted at the school's front entrance by a woman claiming to be the aunt of a child named Bobby Greenlease. 6-year-old Bobby was the son of Robert Greenlease Sr., a wealthy businessman who lived in the affluent Kansas City suburb of Mission Hills. The woman, claiming to be Bobby's aunt, was visibly upset when she told the nun that Bobby's mother had been rushed to the hospital after suffering a heart attack. The nun later recalled that when she'd fetched Bobby, he walked directly to the woman without hesitation, and there was no reason to doubt that the woman was his aunt. The woman then took Bobby by the hand, then led him towards a waiting taxi. About a half hour later, a different nun called the Greenlease family to express the school's condolences to them. The voice on the other end sounded surprised. Mrs. Greenlease hadn't suffered a heart attack, and there was no way his aunt could have collected him from school. Despair set in once both parties realized that Bobby had been kidnapped, and after the Kansas City chief of police begged the governor for as much assistance as possible, the FBI was called in to investigate. One of the first witnesses questioned by federal agents was a Kansas City cab driver named Willard Pearson Creech. Willard told the agents that on the morning of the kidnapping, a woman fitting the description of Bobby's kidnapper climbed into his cab, then asked him to drive her to the Cat's drugstore at Westport and Main Street in Kansas City. After waiting approximately 6 minutes, the cab driver watched as the woman re-entered the cab accompanied by a small boy who looked just like little Bobby. A few hours after the kidnapping, the Greenleases received the first ransom letter, which demanded $600,000 in exchange for the boy's release. The letter also stated that if the money was handed over within 24 hours and there was no funny business, Bobby would be returned safe and sound. A second ransom letter was delivered the following day and contained Bobby's Jerusalem medal to prove the kidnappers were serious. The letter assured them that Bobby was homesick, but otherwise okay, and reiterated the kidnappers' demands for $600,000. The final communication between the Greenleases and the kidnappers was a telephone call received after the cash had been delivered at around 1 a.m. on October 5th. The kidnappers confirmed that they had received the $600,000 in cash and assured the family that Bobby was alive and that he would be returned to them over the next 24 hours. Yet unbeknownst to the Greenlease family, the kidnappers had murdered Bobby not long after the abduction and had buried the body in St. Joseph, Missouri, before escaping to St. Louis with the ransom money. Just over a week later, the St. Louis Police Department received a call from a man named John Oliver Hager, who was a driver for the Ace Cab Company in St. Louis. John mentioned that a woman fitting the description of Bobby's kidnapper had been spotted on Arsenal Street in St. Louis and relayed the description of her male companion to law enforcement. The information John provided quickly led to the arrest of one Carl Austin Hall on the evening of October 6, 1953. Later that night, after a huge amount of pressure from the FBI, Carl Hall led a team of agents to an apartment on Arsenal Street in St. Louis, where his girlfriend, Bonnie Emily Heddy, was taken into custody. Both Hall and Heddy were interrogated by FBI agents, and after admitting that they'd kidnapped Bobby, insisted that practically all of the $600,000 ransom money was still in their possession. Hall admitted to planning the kidnapping, the actual abduction of the victim, and to burying the body in the yard of Bonnie Heddy's home, but he flatly denied having murdered the young boy. At first, Hall and Heddy blamed the murder of young Bobby on a man named Tom Marsh, claiming that the boy had still been alive when they'd handed him over. Yet when the FBI pointed out there was a number of inconsistencies with Hall's story, he admitted that he had fabricated the character of Tom Marsh, and that he and Bonnie Heddy were solely to blame for Bobby's death. Hall told investigators that he and Heddy had driven Bobby to Overland Park, Kansas, after which they dragged him from the van, threw him to the ground, then shot him in the head. They then drove the boy's dead body back to St. Joseph, Missouri, where he buried it in Bonnie Heddy's yard and planted flowers on the grave. Bonnie Heddy admitted assisting Hall in the preparation of the ransom letters and notes of instructions to the Greenlease family concerning the payoff of the ransom, as well as going to the school and obtaining custody of the victim, using the ruse that his mother was ill. Just before 9 a.m. on October 7th, Bobby's decomposing corpse was discovered by FBI agents, buried near the porch of the Hetty residence at 1201 South 38th Street in St. Joseph, Missouri. His tiny body had been wrapped in a large plastic sheet, and a huge quantity of lime had been poured over his corpse. Agents then located some .38 caliber shell casings, and a ballistic analysis determined that they had been fired from a .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver that had been found in Hall's possession at the time of his arrest. On October 30th, Carl Hall and Bonnie Hetty appeared before a federal judge in Kansas City, and both pled guilty to the murder of 6-year-old Bobby. After hearing the evidence for little over an hour, the federal judge recommended the death penalty and sentenced both of them to be executed on December 18th of 1953. "I think the verdict fits the evidence," the judge was quoted as saying. "It's the most cold-blooded, brutal murder I had ever tried." In the end, Carl Hall and Bonnie Hetty were executed together in the Missouri State Penitentiary's lethal gas chamber on December 18th of 1953. Carl was officially pronounced dead at 12:12 a.m., while Bonnie was declared deceased just 20 seconds later. To some, very few murders actually warrant a death penalty, and those that kill are often better left alive to stew in their guilt. Crimes of passion, accidental slayings, or even revenge killings prove that murder is not a black and white issue, and that there are many shades of gray in between. But those that kidnap a 6-year-old child, collect a ransom, but kill them anyway. Some might say that the gas chamber is far too humane a method of execution for people that are capable of such unspeakable evil. Back in the early 90s, Delaware-based lawyer Thomas J. Capano had a life that many of us might find enviable. He was a prominent and prosperous former state prosecutor with high-ranking political connections, and even ran a profitable home construction business during his spare time. He also had a large and loving family consisting of a wife and 4 daughters. But by 1993, his marriage was falling into a downward spiral. Then, right as his marital dissatisfaction was at its peak, he met a young, single woman by the name of Anne Marie Fahey. Fahey was employed as a congressional scheduling secretary who had met Thomas Capano after meeting with Congressman Thomas Carper. Capano and Fahey began a romantic relationship shortly afterward, and as much as they tried to keep their affairs under wraps, it became known to an increasing number of friends and coworkers as the years dragged on. Fahey wasn't the only woman that Capano seemed to be having an affair with, but it seems that Fahey was his primary paramour for the following 3 years. From what I can gather, Capano treated Fahey gently and romantically at first, but as time went by, he grew more and more controlling, overbearing, and violently jealous. When Fahey attempted to end the relationship, Capano refused to allow her to leave him, and told her if she even dared to try, he'd destroy her political career. So instead of risking another confrontation, Fahey reportedly began secretly dating other men and went to great lengths to keep it a secret from Capano. The last known sighting of the couple was on June 27th of 1996, when they met for dinner to once again discuss their relationship. But after that, it was like Anne Fahey had simply dropped off the face of the earth. 2 days later, after becoming increasingly concerned for their daughter's safety, the Fahey family reported her missing. Not long after the missing persons report was filed, an agent with the FBI's Baltimore office heard about the case and offered his assistance to local authorities. Then, as the case progressed, various law enforcement agencies agreed to have the FBI take the lead on the investigation, owing to its vast resources and advanced capabilities. When the FBI learned of Fahey and Capano's affair, investigators quickly zeroed in on him as their #1 suspect. When questioned by police, Thomas Capano claimed that he had invited Fahey to dinner over in Philadelphia, the goal of which was to resolve the problems in their relationship. He said the evening went well, that they'd come to an amiable agreement after a few hours of conversation, and that afterwards, he'd driven her back home before they parted on good terms. The FBI agents were almost sure that Capano was lying to them, But in order to prove it, the team was forced to use a number of creative investigative techniques to determine what had actually happened that night. This included surveillance, toll record analysis, seizure of emails from Capano's law firm and Fahi's office, analysis of gun purchase records, a 4-day search of 2 landfills, psychological profiling, and analysis of financial records. Finally, after a search of Anne Fahi's apartment, the investigation struck gold. Investigators found a number of handwritten letters addressed to Fahi from Capano, some written with an ominous and threatening tone. They also discovered Fahi's diary with numerous entries describing how Capano was a controlling, manipulative, insecure, jealous maniac. FBI agents then searched Capano's home and personal vehicle for traces of Fahi's blood and hair, and quickly found bloodstains on a metal radiator cover and some woodwork. The FBI then tracked down a blood bank which turned out to have a bag of Fahi's blood that she'd generously donated weeks earlier. This way, they were able to confirm that it was Fahi's blood in Capano's home and car. A blood bank search helped recover a container of blood that Fahi had donated weeks earlier, and forensic exams linked Fahi's blood to the blood found in Capano's house. As the investigation progressed, there was a kind of surprise twist. Capano's brother, Jerry, was arrested on various drug and weapons charges towards the end of 1997. In exchange for leniency, he admitted that he'd helped Thomas get rid of evidence which proved he'd murdered Fahi. According to Jerry, after Thomas Capano murdered his young lover, he forced her body into a large fishing cooler that he had purchased about 2 months earlier. Then on June 28th, Tom and Jerry Capano drove Jerry's boat some 70 miles off the New Jersey coast and dumped the cooler into the Atlantic Ocean. The cooler wouldn't sink, so Jerry shot it full of holes with a shotgun that he kept on board for shark fishing, but the cooler still wouldn't sink. Tom then lifted Fahi's body out of the cooler, wrapped 2 anchors around it, threw it overboard, and watched it sink. He then threw the cooler back into the water. The same cooler was later discovered by a group of fishermen who pulled it out from the ocean, plugged the bullet holes, and used it to hold the fish that they caught. The following year, after the story about the cooler made the news, one of the fishermen got in touch with the FBI and reported his find. The cooler then became a key piece of evidence which tied together Jerry's story. Finally, on November 12th of 1997, the FBI swooped in on Thomas Capano after they learned that he was planning to flee the country. During his trial in 1998, one of Tom Capano's ex-lovers told the court that just over a month before Anne Fahi's murder, Capano told her that if she purchased a pistol with her credit card, he'd purchase it from her for double the price she paid for it. With a mountain of damning evidence being turned against him, Capano completely changed his story. He claimed that the pistol-purchasing lover walked in on him and Fahi while they were being intimate, and had been so distraught by the sight that she actually threatened to take her own life with the gun she'd bought. Capano then claimed, as he tried to stop her, the gun went off by accident and killed Fahi. Capano said he then disposed of the body to protect himself and his lover. It made for a compelling story, but it was one the jury simply did not believe, and on January 17th of 1999, they pronounced him guilty for the murder of Anne Marie Fahi. Initially, Thomas Capano was sentenced to death for his crimes, but after a lengthy appeals process, his sentence was downgraded to life in prison without parole. Ironically, Capano later instituted his own death sentence in 2011 when his body was found hanging in his prison cell by prison officials. Efforts were made to revive him, but it was far too late. Capano was dead by his own hand. Anne Marie Fahi's body was never officially found, but we can assume that it's somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, not far from the New Jersey coastline. She might not have received a proper burial, but she certainly got the justice she deserved, as the man who took her life became so racked with pain, regret, and loneliness that he simply couldn't go on living anymore. On the morning of December 16, 1989, an Alabama federal appeals judge named Robert Vance was greeted by a package when he walked out onto his porch. Given that it was the holidays, it wasn't entirely unusual for a gift or two to arrive, so Robert thought nothing of picking it up and bringing it inside his Mountain Brook home. Once inside, and having nothing suspicious about it, Judge Vance set about opening the package to see what was inside. Inside the small cardboard box was a smaller brown parcel, and when Judge Vance tore it open, a loud and devastating explosion ripped through his home, instantly killing him and seriously wounding his wife. The bombing caused a media firestorm, and local police rushed to begin work on what would no doubt be a long and high-profile investigation. Yet just as the investigation was commencing, yet another bombing put an Atlanta-based attorney named Robert Robertson in the hospital. Almost immediately after that, 2 more bomb scares occurred in Georgia and Florida. The first was intercepted while being transported to the federal courthouse in Atlanta, while the other was recovered after being mailed to the Jacksonville office of the NAACP. Further bloodshed was averted by the swift and valorous actions of bomb disposal experts in both states, but the defusal of the 2 bombs was a cold comfort to the general public, who were actually aware that more bombs might have been sent out in the mail. But what sick individual would be spiteful enough to send mail bombs during the holidays? Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation gathered the remnants of the bombs and packages and sent them off to various laboratories for analysis. Next, U.S. postal inspectors worked to learn the path the packages had taken through the postal system, which allowed the FBI to assemble a long list of potential suspects. As federal agents worked their way through the list of suspects, an ATF explosives expert was examining one of the unexploded bombs, only to notice something oddly familiar about its construction. When he reported it to his superior later that day, the explosives expert told them that he not only recognized the design of the bomb, but he could still remember the name of the man who built them that way: Walter Leroy Moody. With the prime suspect identified, the FBI set about surveillance of Walter Moody at home, and at one point, they were able to watch him even closer due to a brief stay in jail. It was during his time in jail that FBI agents discovered that Walter talked to himself, and the FBI realized that bugging his home might result in catching him talking about the bombings. Over the next year, extensive surveillance of Walter Moody revealed his motive for the bombings. The FBI found that Walter had a history of experimenting with explosives, with a conviction for bomb making dating back to the 1970s. According to the trial, Moody had been constructing a bomb in his garage, one that had severely injured his wife when it accidentally exploded. Psychologists determined that Walter's conviction and failed appeals in that case had led him to harbor a long festering resentment of the court system, so it came as no surprise when one of the judges on his unsuccessful appeals turned out to be none other than the first victim, Robert Vance. What's more, a surveillance agent had once noted that Moody frequently expressed racially bigoted opinions, which tied in with the NAACP being targeted with a bomb. It took just over a year to assemble enough evidence to secure a conviction, and in the summer of 1991, Walter was put on trial for the bombings. The trial was tough, to say the least, and it was a chilling testament to Moody's intelligence that he'd taken every effort to conceal his connection to the bombings. However, on June 28th of 1991, based on the extensive investigative work of numerous law enforcement agencies, the jury found Walter Moody guilty of more than 70 charges, including murder and attempted murder. In 2018, after once again failing numerous appeals, Walter was finally executed following a last meal of Philly cheesesteaks, Dr. Pepper, and M&Ms. It marked the end of a brutal and vengeful man who abused the trust Americans have in their postal service to mail violent death to those that have wronged him. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to learn about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember to always microwave your M&Ms.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Talkspace a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, at the beginning of the pandemic, I felt like it would only be a few months and this was all temporary, but now being in quarantine is really the new way of life, and it's incredibly challenging for our mental health. Sometimes I feel so overwhelmed by everything that I have to do at work and keeping in touch with loved ones, and also not being completely stuck in terms of my goals and what I want to accomplish. And I'm really glad that I have my therapist to talk through the ups and downs of how I'm feeling during this really chaotic period. I wholeheartedly recommend Talkspace for therapy too. You can sign up online and start therapy the same day as you sign up. And depending on the plan that you choose, you can text, video, or send voice messages to your licensed therapist, so it's incredibly convenient to have virtual sessions from the comfort of your home. Talkspace is a fraction of the cost of in-person therapy, and instead of waiting for an appointment, you can send unlimited messages to your therapist 24/7, and they'll engage with you daily, 5 days a week. My therapist gave me some really practical guidance that really changed my life for the better, and I'm glad that I found Talkspace and got the support that I needed, and you can too. And as a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off your first month with Talkspace. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com or download the app, and make sure to use the code SCARED to get $100 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's SCARED and Talkspace.com. For most of my childhood and adolescence, I always had weird experiences in my grandparents' home, even after they had moved out of that home. My Nana and Papa lived in the home that all of these experiences occurred in from before I was born up until around 2016, and it's my understanding that the home was built well before they moved in. The layout of the house is fairly important to most of the experiences, so I'll give a little bit of detail. There was an entryway which connected to a formal living room, the main living area, and then a zigzag hallway. Through the main living room you could get to the kitchen and the dining area, as well as my Nana's sewing room. This sewing room was also connected to the formal living room by the according doors, but they were never open. The zigzag hallway contained the master bedroom, a walk-in hall closet, a bathroom, 2 bedrooms, and my papa's study. The study and one of the bedrooms were directly across from each other, at the very end of this hallway towards the very back of the house. I guess I should preface these experiences too by saying that the dynamic of my grandparents and my family were somewhat odd. You see, my grandparents slept in separate bedrooms due to general issues, and my Nana's sleep apnea machine and my disabled uncle stayed in the bedroom at the very end of the hall. My brother and I were there practically every day during the summer since my mum worked, and so most of the stories that I have come from both of us, even after I stopped staying there when I got old enough to stay home by myself. So, from a very young age, I remember always being on edge when I was there. I felt like I was always being watched and followed throughout the house, especially when I would be in that long zigzag hallway. Now, don't get me wrong, my Nana was a hoarder. She hoarded almost anything and everything, but dolls were her main hoard, so I definitely had eyes on me, but this was different. My brother said that he felt the same way, but he chalked it up to being young and scared of our grandparents' crazy house. But it wasn't just feelings, though. I would swear that I would hear footsteps behind me or hear carpet crunch when I was in a room alone. Maybe my brother was right, though, and that these feelings were just us being scared kids or something. Still, a lot of other stuff happened, and it's harder to explain. I mentioned my nana was a hoarder and that she hoarded just about anything. This meant that not only was the formal living room filled with boxes and just boxes of things, but the sewing room, the hall closet, and even the main living room were also filled as well. She would go on these weird cleaning benders where she decided that my brother and I would help her sort her things, under the premise that she was trying to decide what we could sell and what we could keep. Over the years, I saw a ton of weird heirloom stuff, as well as just weird junk that she decided that she needed at one point. But one thing that really stuck out, though, was her giant ventriloquist doll. This doll, like most of her larger dolls, had its own little chair to sit in, and it was kept in this formal living room amongst the boxes. Whenever we would clean too, my brother and I would play the game of Where's Nana's ventriloquist doll because it was almost never in its chair, despite us always putting it back in the chair when we would clean. Looking back, this is something that's actually a little frightening, to be honest. My nana used a walker and had very limited mobility, so it would be impossible for her to have been moving it around. My papa never messed with stuff like that and also had limited mobility, so it wouldn't have been him either. But without fail, each time that we went looking in that room, the doll was always in a new place. Eventually, too, this doll made its way to my house whenever we moved them out of theirs, and it never left its spot in our garage, which makes me think that whatever was in my nana's house enjoyed messing with us. I say whatever was in her house because, truly, I don't know what was going on. I'm a believer in the paranormal and have had other experiences all through my life that have no connection to this house. However, there's just no real way of knowing what type of thing resides in the home because of how my nana was. She just had tons of weird stuff from random garage and estate sales that she went to, so who knows what she picked up that could have had that energy attached to it. There was also just a lot of negative energy in that house, and as someone who believes that negative energy attracts more malevolent spirits, that's another thing that I think could have influenced this house. There's a lot more that I could go on about, but I feel like I've already gone on for too long, so I'll tell the one experience that still really freaks me out almost 5 years later. So, around 2016 to 2017, we moved them out of the home because their health was pretty poor, and the house was just too large and too expensive for them to take care of it anymore. This meant that my mum and I had to clear most of it out and check up on it, since we were the only part of that side of the family that lived in the city. We had come to check up on it and remove things that my nana requested a few times before, but this particular time was different. You see, immediately upon walking in, we were hit with this terrible smell, like rot and sewage. My mum and I panicked when we smelt that smell. They were on a septic line, so it was entirely possible that there was a backup or a gas buildup that could ruin the house. However, after checking the sinks and the toilets and everywhere, we couldn't figure out what the smell was coming from because the water was running clear. My mum was convinced that it was something in the kitchen though, so she checked in there more while I went through the hall closet to find the things that we were trying to remove that day. And while I was in that closet, I felt air move by me as if someone was walking past me towards the back of the house down that hallway. Since it was a walk-in closet, I didn't really think much of it, as my mum could have just gone by me to check the bathroom that was down that hall in her quest to find the source of the smell. But about a minute or two later, from my uncle's old bedroom, I heard the very distinct sound of a suitcase zipper being pulled open. And this sound lasted what felt like forever, like it was just slowly being opened back there. After it stopped, I sort of freaked out and ran into the kitchen where I found my mum still checking the sink. Now, there was just no humanly way possible that she could have gone past me, unzipped that suitcase, and then went back to the kitchen without me running into her. So, I immediately freaked out and told her what I heard. My mum is a huge skeptic, so she didn't take this to be a paranormal experience, but that someone was probably squatting in the house and I had caught them. So, we pretty much left right after that. The next few times that we came before deciding to hire a trash removal company to clear the house instead of us, we never found any evidence of a squatter, and We never smelt that smell again, even after not going to the house for like weeks at a time. And the real kicker to this story, the suitcase that I heard unzip was one of the things that we were meant to find and remove for my nana that day. So I had a haunting 9 years ago. I was a single mother with a 2-year-old boy and my 9-year-old niece. I had gotten custody of my niece due to her mother being an addict. We just moved into a nice apartment and I was really excited to be able to give my kids a nice place. It was newly redone, new carpet, new walls, new trim, new everything. It was a weird setup though. When you walked in, my bedroom was on the right, living room on the left and dining room straight ahead. To the left of the dining room was the smaller bedroom, which also had its own full bathroom. I think it was more for roommates than a family. I started having paranormal encounters though the same day that we moved in, so I always left both bedroom doors open at night so I could see into the kids' room past the dining table. From the start though, I would wake up at 3:12 a.m. every night. A lot of times my son would too, but would be crying. I would wake up to an old woman in my room. She would always stand in the hall that led to the master bath. She would always try to talk to me, but I could never hear her. Then my son would cry, and I would go and comfort him and go back to bed, but sleep was hard to come by for me. As time went on, she would bang on the walls and where the heater was, jiggle door handles, knock photos off the wall, wake me up every single night at 3:12. She got more and more angry too that I wasn't doing what she wanted, I think. So eventually she started appearing as a black smoke-like mass. She would get closer and closer, mumbling something that I couldn't make out. My cat would flee every time, and I could just feel her anger. I could feel the tension and the frustration thick in the air. When she wasn't that black mass too, she appeared more tattered and unkempt. Her hair would be a mess when it was once done up nicely. She would look really tired, sunken in eyes, became more and more frightening. Her behavior was downright aggressive too, and the banging became so loud that even neighbors could hear it. She would rattle the doors violently. I thought someone was trying to break in at one point, but no one ever was there. My dreams were really cruel and tormented, a sort of murder, having my children kidnapped, stuff like that every night. And to be honest, there weren't many nights that I didn't cry myself to sleep. I was doing my best to raise 2 kids, one of which wasn't even mine, work a full-time job and then come home to so much negative energy. Eventually I decided to ask my neighbors about previous tenants as they'd lived there for years. And apparently a woman took care of her elderly mother here, and her mother died in my room. The apartment was totally redone because that woman literally had to wallow in her own feces. The daughter was very neglectful and the pets were also never cleaned up after, and I also found out the reason that I was able to afford that apartment was because the rent was significantly lower than the other identical units. The manager of the apartments never told me about any of this. Anyway, shortly after I woke up again at 3:12, but instead of the old woman or blackness, I saw my son squatting on a dining room chair. I said, "Troy, why are you up?" He looked me straight in the eyes, smiled his sweet smile and whispered, "Mama." I got up to go and get him, but as I reached for him, he just vanished. My heart sank and I could barely breathe. I thought that something had happened to him, so I ran into the kids' room and they were both fine, sleeping away. I cried that night until I was so exhausted that I just fell asleep. But that's when I decided to break my lease and move out. Crazily enough too, she would unpack boxes, she would hide things, she would turn the bathroom light off when I was in the shower. She was trying desperately to talk to me and I had no idea how to listen. I mourned for her a bit. I could feel her pain, but I also had a family to take care of. I had my stuff packed and I moved in under a week. If you have any idea what it's like to be a single parent with 2 kids and a full-time job, then you know that that was an amazing feat. Oddly though, I had a really weird dream after we moved out that there was a diary hidden behind the water tank. Why I never thought to look in there when that was where she kept banging, I'll never know, but I just hope that she found peace. When I was in my late teens, I lived with my dad. We lived in a small trailer, and at the time I smoked cigarettes, and the rule was that I was only allowed to smoke in the living room at night, not in my bedroom, because the smoke would make it to his room and wake him up. So he built a 3-way bunk bed for us when we were younger that was still in use. The top and the bottom bunks faced north, and the middle bunk faced east, and there was about 3 to 4 feet of space under the middle bunk. That was my bunk. Now, it was situated in such a way that I was lying on my back and the door was directly behind my head, which was just enough room for the door to close. I hope that I'm painting the picture right, because all of this is pretty important. So one night, I'm just watching TV in my room. It's late, so I turn everything off and lay down to sleep. I don't recall how long it was until I heard the noises begin, but I start to hear what sounds like children's footsteps go up the hallway behind me, back and forth, slowly at first, and then just quicker and quicker. Then there was some light tapping on the walls, like fingers tapping on the table along with footsteps. But then the footsteps stopped directly behind me in the doorway to my bedroom, which was about 2 or 3 feet away. And the next thing that I hear is the footsteps running into my room and under my bed. To say that I was terrified is a complete understatement. I wanted to wake up my dad, but was way too scared to yell or do anything like that, so instead I grabbed my pack of cigarettes from the TV stand that was close enough to the bed that I didn't have to move much. I lit up and I started blowing the smoke over my head into the hallway. And that did the trick. My dad woke up yelling at me for smoking in my room, and the next day he asked why I was smoking in there, when I'd never done that before, and I told him what happened. He listened intently, and when I was done, he said that he didn't understand why I was scared. You see, my dad was a staunch believer in UFOs and aliens, anything paranormal in fact, and he figured that my 2 younger brothers and I needed to know about this stuff growing up, so he told us all kinds of stories growing up. It really scared us and still affects us to this day, and we're all in our 30s now. But he thought that that was my best chance to make contact. That was my dad, though. He was never scared of the paranormal and always just intrigued. That was 20 years ago or so now, and to this day I can still remember that night like it was yesterday. So my first job was at a McDonald's. This building was attached to a gas station and located off of a busy highway. I was 14, all kinds of bad luck at this stage, and started a 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. This early in the morning, the store was usually empty, so only 3 people, myself included, were in the restaurant. The manager, who was in the back, the cook, who was also in the back, and I, the cashier, who was up front. So I was wiping down the counter when a man who looked to be in his mid-30s or early 40s came in. He didn't order anything, but went straight to the restrooms, which were in the restaurant area just around the corner from my cash. Many truckers and travelers would come in simply to use the washrooms and leave, so this wasn't too uncommon. I didn't think much of it, in fact. But after the man finished, he came up to the counter and said, "Hey, excuse me, I was just in the washroom and one of the toilets is overflowing." I immediately came around the corner and let him lead me towards the restroom, but suddenly I just got a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and stopped dead in my tracks. I became very aware that no one was actually in the restaurant area, and the only other 2 people in the store were in the back that would not be able to hear me if I went into the restroom. The man had the restroom door open and realized that I had paused. He nonchalantly said, "Come on in, I'll show you." which came off innocently enough, but just didn't sit well with me. I smiled and said, "One moment, I'll just go and get my manager, okay?" And I started making my way back to the counter. "It'll only take a minute," he called out. I met my manager in the back and explained to him that a man was complaining about an overflowing toilet. My manager went to check it out, and I followed closely behind him. But when we turned the corner, the man was gone, and we entered the restroom anyway, but there was no toilet overflowing. We exchanged a look, and we never really brought it up again. But to this day, I feel like some divine intervention gave me the wisdom to know not to follow the man into the restroom. The whole situation only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like much longer than that. I was young and trusting, and this man could have done who knows what, and I would never have been hurt. In fact, he could have left, got away with whatever he had planned, and just hit the highway. Also, I never did see him again. I live in a split-level house with my boyfriend, and our bedroom is upstairs. In our bedroom, we have a half window that overlooks the lower split of our house, meaning that there is a roof that comes right under our window. This window also overlooks our backyard, which is all woods and pretty much no neighbours. We never see anyone back there, which is the reason that we didn't have blinds on it. So it was late one night, and we were in bed just fooling around with the bedroom lights on. We carried on and hung out relaxing in bed for an hour or so, and then decided to call it a night. We flipped the lights off, and we were falling asleep. But about 5 minutes after turning the lights off, we hear a man's voice from outside the window in a sing-song voice say, "Good night." We both froze in place, and I mustered the courage to say to my boyfriend, "Did you hear that?" He responds that he did and hops out of bed. He then goes downstairs and gets his gun out of his safe and goes into the backyard while I call the police. Listen, we all know that this was not a smart idea, so let's save it, but we did it anyway. He searches the roof and the yard for a while and finds no one. He returns in the house and replaces the gun in his armory instead of the safe, next to a MacBook Air and $1,000 of cash. The police come and take a report. My boyfriend and I have a sleepless night, but the next morning we go to work as usual. And thankfully, my boyfriend returns home first to find that our house has been broken into and completely destroyed. Everything is thrown apart as if someone was looking for one specific thing. The drawers were turned upside down, the closets were ransacked, cushions off the furniture, etc. My boyfriend calls the police, and while waiting for them to arrive, he assesses the damage, looking for missing items. And a sinking feeling sets in as he realizes that the only thing missing in the house is the gun that he went out with the night before. And when I say only, not even the stack of cash laying next to the gun was missing. After this happened, we got security cameras, motion sensor lights on the outside of our house, and blinds. The police never found the guy or the gun, and I think that we're lucky that we haven't had anything related happen again. But the question still haunts us, though. How long had he been watching us, and was it just once? Had it been since we moved in? Where was he hiding while watching my boyfriend look for him carrying that gun? What creepy message was he trying to send by only stealing the gun? I still can't shake that sing-song voice that he said that night as well. So I go to a high school with about 500 people. This happened during my sophomore year. I'm a junior now, and Mark had other issues before this happened. He started cutting his arms in class. I was sitting 2 seats away from him and watched the blood just roll down his arm. He ended up being reported to the office and was even sent to the YOC for about a month, if I'm right. The YOC is basically this youth opportunity center. It's a mental hospital sort of juvie center for kids, and he came back and he honestly seemed fine. He said that he was never really suicidal, that he only cut his arms for attention, which made sense for him because of his kind of, messed up childhood. But on the day everything happened, I had no clue about anything. So during my 6th hour class, the school resource officer appeared at the door of the classroom. One of my friends was standing behind him. The SRO told my teacher that he needed me immediately. I had no clue what was going on. I just thought that I was being randomly drug tested or something, as it's pretty common in my school. I tried asking why we were going to the office in the first place, and I didn't get any response. He took the two of us into the conference room where 2 police officers were standing, and they questioned me first. As I walked into the room, he shut and locked the door behind me. One of the police officers blocked the door, the other blocked the window. I was sort of petrified at this stage because I had no clue what was going on. But the conversation went like this. "Have you heard anything today?" About what?" "There were threats made against our school. Your name came up in conversation." "What do you mean my name came up in conversation? I haven't heard anything. Who made the threats? And who said that I would know anything about it?" "Mark made the threats. When we questioned some other people, your name popped up, and they said that you might know something." "Who said my name?" "We can't tell you. I understand that they probably couldn't tell me who said it due to confidentiality reasons, but it's so frustrating to be locked in a room with 3 police officers who are acting like you've done something wrong like that, especially when you haven't, and you don't know what is going on or who said these things. To this day, I still have no clue who mentioned me by my name." "Well, I've heard nothing. The only class that I have with him is 5th period, and he wasn't there today. We don't talk outside of class either, and the only reason that we talk in that class is because, well, we sit at the same table, so we have to work together some days." "Are you sure?" "I'm positive. I don't know anything. All of this is news to me as well, man." "Well, okay. You're free to go." They opened the door, took my friend in, and I went back to class. I was kind of off in shock, but as soon as I walked through my class door, everyone was bombarding me with questions about what had happened. I ignored them and I put my head down for the rest of the class, but later that night I saw on Facebook that the school had posted a message. I don't remember what it was exactly due to it being deleted quickly, but from my recollection it said something like, "Parents and students of my school, 2 students reported that another student had made threats against our school. We've handled the situation and there's nothing to worry about." The actual post was longer, but I honestly don't remember it. But I told my parents about everything that happened that day, and they immediately wanted some more information. I couldn't give it to them, obviously, and at that point, I didn't know about the hit list or even his arrest. All I knew was that SG had threatened to shoot up the school. And the next day, the crap really hit the fan. I found out that he had told people about his plans during 1st hour, and he was taken out of class and arrested during 4th hour. He was going to do it during 5th hour, start with the class that he was in, which I was in too, and then he would head to the cafeteria. And man, do I still get chills when I think of this very moment. During lunch, my best friend came up to me and told me about the hit list Mark wrote, and even showed her during 1st hour. She didn't get the chance to tell me the day before, but the other guy who was there confirmed everything as well. And they both said that I was allegedly on it. I was the 3rd name down, and evidently he described in detail how he was going to kill me. And luckily, somebody else stopped it from happening, or else I would be dead before I even got to graduate high school. To this day, I still don't know why he could have possibly wanted to kill me like that. I barely even spoke to the guy. I was polite in class if I had to work with him, and we had no negative interactions, so I honestly have no clue what I did to make him so desperately want to kill me. As I understand it, he did have a gun in his locker as well. It wasn't a joke like his friends thought. He really intended to do it. I was relieved that I was alive and that nothing happened, obviously, but I was also out of mind with horror at the thought of someone plotting my death like that. About 2 weeks later, though, my dad and I got into the Dollar General in our town. Keep in mind, my dad has no clue what Mark looks like. We walk in to buy something for dinner, and I see Mark out of the corner of my eye. He's staring at me so intensely that I just wanted to run out of the store, but I stuck close to my dad and told him to hurry. He looked at me confused, and I told him that I would explain it later. Mark was following us around the store, and I could barely breathe. I don't have the words to describe just how scared I was, but my dad and I got what we needed, left the store, and we got in the truck. As soon as I was in the truck, too, the doors were locked, and my dad turned to me and asked, "Who was that? He looked like he wanted you dead or something." And I replied that was Mark. At this point, we were thoroughly panicked, not only because he was roaming free, but because he knew where I lived. We had security cameras, sure, but knowing that person who has adamantly expressed his desire to kill you knows where you live, man, it's terrifying. The school, as well, has since acted like this never even happened. In fact, one of the administrators told me and my family that we were overreacting when we wanted to know if he'd be back at school because, according to them, I was never in any real danger. Luckily, or perhaps sadly, the kid is no longer at my school, and he's currently in some type of jail because he actually murdered his own mother. He pushed her down the stairs, and she was allegedly found dead in some sort of makeshift body bag. Thankfully, he was caught, and I don't think that he's going to get out anytime soon, but still, man, what a wild ride that was. So, first let me say that I debated about posting this here in the first place because, well, I may just be overreacting about a few weird things that have happened in the last couple of weeks here at my house, but then I decided to go ahead and share it anyway and see what you guys think about it. And please, do tell me if I am overreacting. I really won't be offended at all if anyone tells me that I'm just being silly. So first off, our house has like a basement crawl space that's only accessible from the outside, through a door directly underneath my bedroom window and about 10 feet away from the bottom of the steps leading up to the back deck. It's a fairly large space, in fact, dirt floor and concrete walls, clean and plenty big enough for a grown man to stand up in. Until recently, it was sort of half full of junk, mostly from our kitchen reno, like paint cans and equipment and extra floor tiles and such, and we had a padlock on it. We asked our yard guy to do some extra work that included cleaning it completely out, and when it was empty, we didn't bother putting the lock back on though. It has a sliding bolt on it that keeps it closed in addition to this little loopy thing that you put on the padlock, so we just slid in the bolt and we called it good. I mean, there was absolutely nothing in it, so there was no point in locking it, right? Well, a couple of weeks ago, my boyfriend was out on the back deck emptying the recycling bins and noticed the door open. Someone would have definitely had to have opened it too. The sliding bolt is a bit rusty and wouldn't easily come open like that, and definitely wouldn't have opened on its own. He went and checked it out. Nobody there. Still completely empty. He thinks, well, okay, someone was obviously poking around and didn't find anything interesting, but he did tell me about it and reminded me to keep the doors locked when he isn't home. A few days after that, I had the dog outside with me, and he ran straight to the door and started sniffing and scratching at it, and I noticed that it was slightly open again. I opened it, went inside, walked around, but there was nobody there. Let me add too that we have a lot of trees and wildlife on our property, including raccoons and groundhogs in addition to tons of squirrels. We have one huge oak tree that overhangs the roof covering the master bedroom, so it's nothing unusual to hear squirrels and other animals on the roof with their little pattering feet and scratching sounds and whatnot. But yesterday I was here alone, laying in bed just reading a book. The house was completely silent. Usually the dog will lay in the bed with me, but he was sort of fidgety acting. He was pacing and just sort of acting weird in general. I was hearing the usual late afternoon squirrels or whatever on the roof, but then I heard a noise that is clearly the crawl space door creaking open. It's directly underneath the window to my right, so I stand up and creep over to the window, crack the shades a tiny bit to peek out, and I see a guy starting up the steps to the back deck, having just exited the crawl space. I immediately said, "Oh heck no," dropped the shades, and headed up the hall directly to the door that he was heading for to confront him. And at that same moment, my dog just went absolutely ballistic barking and beat me to the door, but when I got there, he was nowhere in sight. I only saw him through the window for maybe a second, and I only saw him from the back as he was heading up the steps. He was wearing some sort of a ball cap, so I couldn't have even said what color his hair was. I'm guessing that my dog scared him away, but what was he doing, just walking up to my porch in broad daylight like that, with someone obviously home, if he hadn't planned on knocking on the door? And no one would knock on that door anyway, because people come to the front to knock, not walk all the way around the back where the trees in the backyard are. I waited a few minutes though, then got my pepper spray out of my purse and went to investigate. And sure enough, the crawl space door was open again. No one inside, thankfully, but when my boyfriend got home, he put the padlock back on it. Then he got my gun out of the safe, where it's been for years, and insisted that I keep it under the mattress on my side of the bed. I only agreed to do that after he loaded it with rat shot, because I don't think that I could shoot a human being, not even in self-defense, and rat shot won't do much more than scare someone with the noise of the gunshot. He was really angry at me that I went by myself into the basement to go and check things out like that, but I'm just more angry than frightened, if I'm being honest. I don't know if I'm overreacting, that just because someone had been inside the basement a few times, I automatically assumed that the man that I saw was responsible and meant harm. I'm fairly certain that he did come from there, though, because I definitely heard the door open just seconds before I saw him on the steps. But with it locked up, though, now, I guess if someone had been routinely in and out of it, that's going to stop. Like I said, I just don't know if I'm freaking out over nothing or if this is more serious. I'm keeping my doors locked just in case, though, and I'll definitely be keeping a lookout. And if anything else happens, I'll be sure to let you guys know.